Okay, we are recording, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Chrissy and I obviously are going to be talking about the newer approach to tree inventory that we've been working on for a number of years now, and we get questions from other agency staff from time to time about, so we figured it'd be a good topic to kind of get everybody on the same page about. I guess I'll back up here. As Steve can attest to, and I have a little bit of experience with, maybe Jordan as well, typically community tree inventories at the agency have been done through a windshield tally where you're collecting data about species in different size classes with hash marks. This was a great way to get sort of a snapshot in time of the community forest for a particular town. The pros and cons there were, of course, it's faster than collecting digital data on a device of some sort. That's really, for a lot of communities, all they're looking for is where are we at right now, as opposed to sort of a living document that is constantly updated. The downsides are you don't collect any information about the particular location of any one tree. You're not able to collect information about the management history or photographs of that tree over time. So the short version is that, you know, the old approach was much faster, and we are getting the process streamlined for collecting GIS data for trees in communities. But it still does sort of lag behind the more quick and dirty approach of driving the streets of the town with a clipboard and making a mark for each tree in a certain species and size class. Steve, before we move on, did you have any comments on the traditional approach to inventories you wanted to share with everybody? I'm putting you on the spot a little bit.
No, that's all right. I guess I've done my share of them, and you're right, Graham. That's exactly why, you know, the windshield surveys are pretty quick and dirty all the time. But you're right, it doesn't allow us to kind of keep an ongoing record as much as maybe these digital ones would be.
Right, and so the intent today is not to say that this is the new way for all inventories moving forward. This is just another tool in our belt that we can make available to communities. But there are still cases where a windshield survey may be completely appropriate for whatever the goals of the community are. That's really what kind of dictates which approach we might take. So with the way we're going about things now in this digital environment, we're able to take a lot of inventory data that was collected through a grant of Adams called CTAP that wrapped up in about 2011 or 12, as memory serves. We did about 65 communities. I had just come on in the agency when that was finishing up, so I was able to help do a few of those on the tail end that weren't quite finished. And fortunately, the license that we have with Tree Plotter, which is the software we're using currently, they were gracious enough to import all that data so that we have a statewide platform of 97 communities that have inventory data, not always complete, not always very current, but it's nonetheless data that we can use to tell us a bit about what's going on throughout the state or in a particular community. So Tree Plotter is the software developed by Planet Geo. It's one of maybe a dozen different software suites that are out there that are all pretty good. We're not, we are fans of Tree Plotter, but are open to the notion that there are others out there that might be comparable and worth considering as well. So we always like to mention that to our partners that, you know, as a state agency, we're certainly not salespeople for Tree Plotter, but we find it very useful to be able to take away the monetary challenge for a community the size of Pierce or Neely and give them access to this tool. The win-win scenario for us is that we get to house all that data in exchange for making it free for them to use for some amount of time.
We ended up working with Claire on also developing the Survey 123, and it's all within ArcGIS. And the reason why we did that is because Tree Plotter is all web-based. You go to your browser, you type in pg-cloud/Nebraska. It takes you to our platform. You have a login, and then that's how you access everything. Well, as we were going through some of our more rural communities, we were finding a lot of issues, even with our mobile jetpacks, that we weren't getting enough service to be able to make it operate. And so we were just dragging. And so Claire was like, well, why don't I just make a Survey 123 and kind of make our own map and make it mimic Tree Plotter? It's like Graham said, they uploaded all of that CTAP data from 2011. And so they call it crosswalking. And basically, as long as you have a field over here that has the same data that needs to go into the field over here, you can draw a line between them and say, I want this one to fill this one. And so we're able to transfer that information. We can collect either online or offline with Survey 123. And in the field, what I've experienced is I was on the golf course in Bridgeport, and there's some spots that are okay with service and other spots that were not. And so where it wasn't, I would just store them in my outbox. And then as soon as I got service, I would just send all of the surveys in. Well, once we were done with that, we reached out to Claire, and Claire was so gracious enough to take that information. And it always comes out as a CSV file. And I think there's other formats, but we most commonly use the CSV file format because that's what's easy to translate that data back into Tree Plotter. So we do have two methods of collecting, just depending on how much service you do or don't have.
So as far as pros and cons for digital inventories, the pros are, obviously this is a powerful management tool, as we'll demonstrate here in a little bit. This behind the curtain of the Tree Plotter user interface, we're collecting data that's really no different than what most counties and many communities have for their other utilities and infrastructure. So the traffic lights, the power lines, the sewers, those are all GIS data. The information about a tree is really no different, and it can live as its own layer amongst that other infrastructure data, which can be really useful at the city or the county level for planning as well. The downsides, as Chrissy mentioned, is that with Tree Plotter, we need to have some level of cellular service in order to be continually adding information as it's being collected. So with the Survey 123 tool that Claire's developed, that gives us the flexibility to still collect GIS data on trees in the field in areas where service is spotty or non-existent.
Right. We'll talk more too about, I guess, what equipment we use in the field, and some pros and cons about that too. But ultimately, we just want to know why. We want to know where we're at, what do we have, so that way we know where we want to go, and we can start planning on how we're going to do it. So really having this tree inventory is setting a foundation for communities to set goals, and sometimes their goals for their inventory, you know, it might be one method or the other. It's just whatever works best for them, their time and their resources that they have available. And so like Graham said, there were 65 communities that did the CTAP inventory. You know, that was grant funded, bunch of interns. One of the downsides to it was that we had quite a few communities that were not completed. There's some missing areas of data within some of those CTAP inventories, but it still gives us a fair idea of what that looked like in 2011. There's been some comments too that maybe the interns didn't have great tree ID, but at the end of the day, Graham always says this, a maple is a maple. You're going to manage a maple no different than a maple. You know, a lot of us, we want to talk the next language and say whether or not it's silver, sugar, etc. And we just want to know what's being successful across the state and what's not as far as species, cultivar, and variety go.
Yeah, it's definitely important to correct any tree ID errors early on if you can identify them. But it's also important not to let perfect become the enemy of good. Any inventory that's being a collaboration between us as an agency and partners in a community, it's going to have some amount of data error in it. And as long as it's an acceptable amount and you intervene in instances where you're able to identify it early, then it's important just to keep moving forward, knowing that getting identification to at least the genus level is 90% of what we're trying to accomplish from a management standpoint.
Right.
So for equipment, it's usually not much of an issue as much as the service signal issue is. Tree Plotter is really just a website that you get to. Any device that's able to get onto the internet and navigate to a website is potentially useful as a data collection tool. If you're spending the whole day collecting data, it's better to have a tablet with a large screen. You'll be navigating a lot of pull down menus that we'll see in just a little bit here. So a larger screen is better for long-term data collection, but there are also glare issues and battery life issues that we run into. So fortunately,
We
the
had
jetpacks.
Yeah,
Oh,
we
go
had
ahead.
some older devices that were struggling to, we had to carry around extra battery packs to be able to keep them charged or plug them into the pickup while you are just driving along doing street tree inventory and just making sure that it's continually plugged into that power source if there is issue. Graham and I got these mini iPads, and so far we've loved them, absolutely loved them. As far as, yep, perfect. As far as the communities go, we encourage them to get the tablet because like Graham said, if you're doing it on your phone, it hides a lot of stuff. So that way you can see the map in the middle. And so you just have to learn where all of that stuff gets hidden. And you're constantly just pushing those buttons to unhide it, do what you need to do, and then let it go. With a larger screen, it formats to where it hides very few things.
Yeah, what I find myself doing is I'm constantly facing north when I'm doing my data collection for two reasons. One, that's the orientation of the satellite image that we'll see that you're using to place your data points. And then you also have the shade of your own body on the screen that keeps the glare from being a real problem. So you can turn the brightness of the display down to save battery life and not need it quite so bright in order to see it well.
Right.
But typically, yeah, we're doing these almost exclusively for public trees alone, just like we might for a windshield survey. The parks, the streets, the schools, the municipal buildings, any of those public spaces and rights of way.
We try to remind the tree boards that they are not only responsible for just what is maintained on the city dime. It is in their interest that the entire community forest is under their advisory. And so that includes these other places like the schools or maybe even the county courthouse that is on their own separate budget, totally different entity, but it's still a public space. And so we do encourage them to do public trees. Larger communities, Graham, remind me, which one is it that you're working with that only has parks right now?
Yeah, City of Bellevue sort of washes their hands of the expense of street trees, pruning and removal. And there's lots of other Nebraska communities that are like that. So at the end of the day, it's really up to them to determine the scope of the project and what's useful for them. But we always encourage them to inventory those street trees, even if they don't pay to maintain them. They're still managing them in the sense of issuing a permit for planting, condemning street trees when they need to be cut down. And so that's a level of management that we always feel warrants putting them into the inventory. Who? So obviously we're working with community partners to get this done. As we'll talk about in a little bit, there's a couple different scales of project that require different levels of involvement from us as an agency. But what's really important to remember is that we do have limited capacity to go out and do these inventories. And so we have to not necessarily pick and choose who we offer this service to, but more carefully determine what level of involvement we're going to have and make sure they're aware of that up front. So it's not something that they think we're going to come in and just do for them wholesale. And then they find out that they need to get a lot of it done themselves.
Right.
But lots of different levels of, city partners that get involved with the inventory. Obviously, it's ideal to do these during leaf on when identification is easiest. There are cases where I've worked with communities to collect their data on printed out maps so that it can be entered into the computer back at their desk without entering the data in the field. That has some pros and cons. Obviously, it's a two-step process. It's going to take a little bit longer, but if people are more comfortable doing the actual data entry at their desk, then they can take a clipboard around town and collect that data on maps that are printed out ahead of time for them.
Yeah, ultimately, the reason why we do leaf on is because that's when you are going to be able to best judge what the condition is of that tree. And so we have had a few very excited, terrific people that want to inventory as soon as they get their login and they learn how to use it and it's still winter. And I'm like, all right, if you really want to get some practice in, go inventory all the evergreens in your parks or do something of that sort, because we can, for the most part, be able to identify all of the fields that we need to for evergreens in the winter. But as Graham said earlier, when we're kind of deciding or determining where do we put our energy and our efforts, it really comes down to when the community is willing and motivated to put forth their effort. And so we've had communities show us a lot of interest, but they don't commit to being motivated and providing effort on their end. They think that we're just going to come in, do it for them, hand them this nice, pretty package with a bow on top, and then walk away. But we want to make sure that they are taking a part in the process all the way through so that they understand fully, why are we doing this? How did we do it? And what is the outcome? Because they're going to be the ones that go and talk to their neighbors, talk to their city council or their village board, and be able to share that information. They are the ones on the ground in their communities making those relationships.
Definitely. So the process always starts with the community reaching out to Chrissy or I. If you have communities that are interested in this, certainly reach out to one of the two of us. I put our contact info on the last slide, but I'm sure you guys all have that already. Chrissy had a note here about David.
Yeah, David was working on a bunch of pest surveys, and he, I believe at one point was using Collector, which was the version before Survey 123. And we were talking about how it would be really beneficial if any of the ash data that he was collecting would be all on our state platform in one place. And so he only needed a couple of fields added to the form that we had. And so we went ahead, added those fields, and now any community that he goes to and does a pest survey, whether it's for walnut, ash, I think tree of heaven he was looking for, those communities might not be active, but our staff is collecting it. So why do it twice? And so it was something very quick, easy, and we would love to do that for anybody who has a use for it in that way. And we can always add fields, move them around and everything else. Graham will show you that here in the next slide. But the big thing is we just want to manage all of our state data in one place. Right.
So there's a number of ways that we can kind of determine the scope of the project. You can go off the population of the community and with some pretty simple math, 1-to-1 public trees to people. That's going to vary, of course, but at least gets you in the ballpark on how many data points you might be looking at collecting. And if Adam were on here, I remember from CTAP that he had a way of using the number of street miles in a community as a way of estimating how much data there was to collect as well. So there's a couple of ways we can kind of get a sense of how big a project we have ahead of us with one community or another. So the process, we'll typically speak with our initial point of contact in the community, kind of describe the same information that we're telling you guys on what the process is like. Depending on the size of the community, if we're not going to be coming in and just doing a full inventory for a community in a single afternoon, then we're usually doing some upfront training with a cohort of volunteers from the community or city staff or a combination of the two. We show them how the process works, make sure they're comfortable with it on the front end. Then we let them go collect the rest of their inventory data. And then on the back end, then of course we come back and give them some management recommendations based on what that inventory data is showing. And we have a inventory report template that Chrissy has put together that's really useful for having some general language and then some more specific fields that we fill in based on what we're seeing. Anything to add there, Chrissy?
No, that's basically, I mean, that is the process that we've developed. Going forward, it might change a little bit, but ultimately hear from them, show them how to do it, train them. We are the in-between for IT. And then of course the inventory report and the management recommendations, just as Graham explained.
So when you're in the field and you pull up Tree Plotter, what you're basically looking at initially is the satellite imagery for that community. You can zoom in on it. You can click a button that will center the map on your location, but the data points themselves are being placed manually with your finger based on where you see a tree on that satellite imagery. So we're not relying on triangulation of satellites to get that pinpoint accurate. That accuracy continues to get better, but it can still be 3 to 6 meters off depending on how much canopy cover is above you, what the weather is like. So we find that it's much better to place that data point with your finger where you see the tree. There are 4 basic fields that we require be filled out. You can go Latin name instead of common name, but one's going to populate when you place the other in. So you go to this drop-down menu, put in Amber Maple, it's going to populate the Latin name automatically for you. Or if you're wanting to go the Latin name route, then it'll put the common name in. I'm going to put in the DBH for the tree. Just like the windshield tallies that have always been done, these are size classes. So you'll enter an estimate for that DBH rather than taking the time to wrap a tape around everything or use a Biltmore stick. We want this to go as fast as possible. From the estimate on that DBH, it's going to assign a size class for that tree that's about a 1/2 foot increment. We have 0 to 3 inches, 4 to 6 inches, and then just 1/2 foot increments from there. So as long as you're able to estimate a tree DBH within within that 1/2 foot range, then you're going to be just fine as far as that goes. And then finally, assigning a condition and what type of tree are we talking about? Is this tree in an arboretum? Is it on the streets? Once you assign one of these inventory types to that tree, then it's also going to auto-populate a land use that is used to calculate the eco services that the tree provides later when we want to do reports.
And the big thing is on the inventory type, they always have to identify what other is. It might be a historical museum or some other building like that, a villa. However, it's at the end, what it does is it allows us to then filter any information that you put into this form. We can then filter it back out and narrow down to just that one field. We can go in and say, I want to see just the cemetery trees, and it will run all of the data, all of the information for just those cemetery trees. So you could technically go give the cemetery board their own tree report, give the school their own tree report, and then give the city their own tree report. At the end, we do typically in the inventory report, we do a total sum of everything. And then at the end, break it down and just do condition and species, top 10 species, I believe, that are in those areas. So that way they at least have an idea. If they're interested, they can come talk to us and get more information.
Yep. As you see here, there's some other bells and whistles, some other useful information you can collect. It slows down the data collection process. Sometimes the observations are something that you want to have the city staff come through and add later as they feel they need to. But there is a box at the bottom of the left-hand column, watch this tree. If it's a tree that needs to be monitored more closely and frequently, then you can easily check that box in order to segregate those out and look at them all by themselves, as we'll see in a little bit.
Right.
You can also take photos of trees if you want to be able to refer back to previous photos, get a sense of what level of decline a tree is in, or recovery in some cases. If the tree was funded by a grant, we can check this box, and a pull down menu will be able to identify which grant funded that tree. As Chrissy mentioned, there's some pest survey data that can be entered for our internal purposes as needed. And then there's some automatically populated information about which user collected the data and what date and that sort of thing.
Now, mind you, this winter, we just did a user role update. And so what Graham is showing you is what our staff can see. The version that the community sees is actually slimmed down from this. I don't believe that the city or the community user role can see the pest survey information or some of these other fields, because likely they will not be entering information for that, and we don't necessarily need them to be interfering with our internal research that we're working on. And so it does change a little bit. So depending on what role somebody is set up with, they might see something different than you do. Yeah.
And there is also this history tab that can collect information about what's been done to the tree in the past. So if it's a community that has a work order software they already use, then this can be integrated with that for an additional fee that the community pays. And then as work orders go out about deadwood pruning tree number 2438, then as that work order comes back in completed, it'll be automatically updated into the inventory so that it's not an extra step to add that information in. So let's just kind of give you a sense of what the scope is like. So here's an inventory I did last summer for Odell, a pretty small community. There were 243 trees that I collected data for. It took, the better part of half a day. By the time you add travel time down there and back, it's mostly a day to do an inventory of this size. As you see on the right, we have a legend for color coding of what species of tree were in there. If there's no number next to that species, that means that there's just one. And otherwise, there will be a number next to it telling you how many of those trees were included in the inventory.
Steve, did you have a question?
Yeah. So Graham, did you do this by yourself then?
Yeah, this is representing like a project that was small enough that it was easier for me to just go in and collect that data and then provide that to them, rather than spending a lot of time. I did talk with the tree board and give them a sense of what we were doing, but it was small enough that it was just best that I went in and did that myself. But good question. That's why I picked Odell, to kind of show you the small end of the spectrum, and we'll get bigger as we go through here.
We'll show you some case studies and explain how we determine what that process looks like, what our involvement looks like. But just looking here, I guess, like Graham said at Odell, the numbers are nice. Everybody likes to see the colored dots. I think on the next one, so they have a population of 307 and there's 243 trees. So just pay attention to that up at the top. We try to kind of give you an idea of population, number of trees, and how much time it took.
Now, the default is this data is going to be displayed by species, but we can also, once the data is collected, we can look at it based on different criteria. So we can ask a tree plotter to display this same data based on the condition of the trees that we've assigned to them. So this allows the community to go through and Maybe they want to uncheck all these boxes except for dead or poor, and they want to just see where the poor condition trees are so that they can quickly and easily identify those locations and monitor those trees specifically because they're in worse shape than most of the other ones are. Another thing we can do is filter out certain species. If we just want to kind of prepare for emerald ash borer in Odell, then they can look at just where all the ash trees are in the community. They could also filter this by size if they were just kind of curious where the really large trees are or the newly planted trees. So once the data is in the system, you can submit a query and filter it based on the different criteria that you've already
Right.
assigned to them.
And that is something that only some of these features they can do on their end. Again, there's different allowances between the user roles. So we will have access to more filter options, but the community is still going to be able to do what Graham's showing you here, is check the boxes on and off to see where their species are, change it between, displaying it by species or size or genus or condition. So this is ultimately then what we start using to be able to develop our inventory report. The system is going to automatically calculate what your top 10 species are, what your top 10 genus are, tell you the percent. You can change it from a pie graph to a bar graph to a tabular. And the tabular is just a table that's going to show you the breakdown and actually give you the physical number rather than just a percent of your total tree. So this is where we start having that conversation of, oh, wow, you have 22% silver maple and you have 12.6% green ash. That's concerning. And this is why. So we start to take these out of Tree Plotter and start putting that into that inventory report to build on that conversation of what do you have now and where do we want to go and what's some management recommendations for that. This is one of the other really cool things that it does. It automatically calculates the ecosystem benefits. Graham was talking about that field that you have to enter which tree type it is, whether it's an arboretum, a street, a school, etc. And it automatically fills that next field. Well, that next field goes into the algorithm that spits out these numbers. But this is kind of the fun part that we get to go back to and say, okay, your 243 public trees provides a total annual benefit to your community of $38,493. Now, of course, as you get more trees, that number gets bigger and way more exciting. But to be able to show them and break it down and say, okay, like this is how much runoff prevention you have. This is how much energy savings you have. This is how much carbon is being stored and sequestered. And so these are the numbers that are more typically better understood by non-tree people. They see numbers, they can understand numbers. But if you start throwing a bunch of different species at them, that's a little bit confusing. So this is one of the kind of the fun gems of the program that we're using.
Yeah, and the follow-up meeting on this report is really important too, because the city of Odell probably doesn't pay to treat their stormwater. We have very few communities that do that. And so it's important they understand that city of Odell probably doesn't realize that 13,000 in benefits for stormwater because that's typically, that's calculated as an offset of costs for treating water that they would otherwise have to if the trees weren't there. So then we can help them kind of understand what is a realistic number that these trees are providing. Yeah, Kendall.
Does it also determine other?
Kendall, you're cutting out.
Categories here?
Sorry, you cut out a little bit. Can you please repeat that?
Yeah, my internet is bad right now. I was wondering if it covered other benefits that aren't listed here, like health and.
It does not, unfortunately. This is primarily based off of the iTree algorithms. They are basically just pulling those algorithms into their system and bringing it all into one interface. And so No, it does not automatically do that. It would be great if it did.
Now, we can export this inventory from Tree Plotter and put it into iTree and use some of the other tools that haven't been integrated already, but these are the big picture eco services that we talk about most frequently with trees, but there are some other tools in that iTree suite that you would need to actually take the data from Tree Plotter and put it in there to get some of those other benefits you mentioned.
Great, thanks.
Yep. So kind of similar scale, Trenton, a little bit higher population, but we're still kind
Yeah.
of below.
Trenton's tree board consists of 2 people. Their population is 560. This is very typical. Rachel Allison went down. She spent about 3 hours one day collecting. And then I went down and I spent about 3 hours collecting. And between the 2 of us, we ended up doing 341 trees. So this is one of those cases where there's far less trees than what the population is, but just kind of gives you an idea. The reason why NFS staff did the majority of this is because they don't have the manpower. They have the drive. They're incredibly interested in the data, but they just do not have the capacity to spend the time to collect the data. And so that's where we do kind of start asking ourselves, how much do we help them with? So I think, Graham, what's the next one? Oh, Hannah, you got a question?
Yeah, so you say far less trees than population, but clearly there's a lot of trees that aren't. So these are just public trees.
These are just public trees. So this is like the schools, the county courthouse. This is the ball field, the stadium that's out there, any of the street trees, and that's it. And so, yes, there's a lot more trees on private property that are not inventoried. And I think Graham had one community that they had the capacity and they were incredibly interested. And so they inventoried everything, private and public, which they can do if they want to, but we are only going to help them collect data on the public trees.
Yeah, Newman Grove has alleys down the middle of every block. So they were able to collect private tree data as well without having to traipse through people's yards. And they had the desire and the capacity to do that. So they're working on a 100% inventory in that case. And it might be worth digitizing that at some point. They're doing all that on paper for their own reasons. Yeah, so if we get to a little bit larger community like Morrill here, Chrissy could talk about that.
Yeah, so they also only had a tree board of like 3 or 4 people. And out of those 3 or 4 people, they really only had one person that could dedicate time to tree collection. And it was their park superintendent. And so what I did is I kind of made a deal with him and I said, okay, I will come in and inventory all of your street trees, but I want you to inventory your park trees, because I wanted him to understand how it worked, get some skin in the game, and be able to understand, what am I doing out there? And so we worked together on the golf course, which is down there on the bottom. And so it was kind of that split. I did quite a bit, but they still did some. And that's just because of the size of community. Grant, on the other hand, though, they're at 1,300. So far, they've done about 730 trees in 2 seasons, and their tree board member is retired and he has all the time in the world. And so he dedicated his personal time to do the entire tree inventory. So I have not collected anything in Grant. So it's not necessarily just on community size. It's about their capacity and what they have available, and just kind of trying to understand that and gauge that. I think. Yeah, Bridgeport is another one. Amanda helped with this one. We went down and did this is a flip. So the tree board did all of the street trees, and most of the park trees are here in town, but they had a small cemetery that was just west of town. I did all of that. And then Amanda and I went and did the golf course, because that was something that was just, there was a lot of trees on the golf course. And so for us to be able to help them just crank that out and get it done, that's what we ended up doing. And that took us about two seasons. But there you can see their population is 1,400 and we inventoried 1,700 trees.
I'm seeing a lot of green dots. So after just a little bit of time looking at these, you can start to see where some diversity issues are going to pop up even before the report gets run.
Right. You can see all the ash that are red down there along the creek bottom.
Yeah, and that's worth
But-
noting. We don't typically recommend spending a lot of time and effort on those naturalized, riparian buffers or
Right.
forested areas. This is important to collect data about trees that the city manages. So
Right.
in as much as you're managing a creek bottom, go ahead, but usually that's a different level of management, if any.
The rule of thumb that Amanda and I used on that creek bottom was if it was more than 3 inches in diameter, then we would inventory it. And the nice thing about this is that once you enter data for one tree, and there's one right next to it that is exactly the same, you can hit this button that transfers everything over to that next form. So you're not entering that information every single time. You're just saying copy last, and it'll copy it again. You might change a couple fields, save it, drop a pin, copy last, leave it, change it, and keep rolling. And so like this windbreak that's up here in the top right, that's exactly what we did. Doak can speak to what's going on in Shadron. I came up and I helped do just a little bit of data collection on some street trees, but for the majority, their tree board rocked out. They did a lot of work, and we have just a few more trees to finish, but within 2 seasons, that's kind of getting finished. Doak, what did you think of the program?
Can you hear me, Christy?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, first of all, thanks much to you, Christy, and Graham for all you do here with this community tree inventory tree plotter program that you are talking to us about today. It's having been one full season through using this tool, I found it to be very user friendly as I rolled on, helping the Shadron Tree Board to conduct this inventory. So we had very few glitches, and I also wanted to thank Fred and Bryce. I talked both of those gentlemen into taking some streets as well, so that we can move this thing along.
You mean dragged him kicking and screaming, right?
No, those two enjoyed getting out of the woods in August when it was 102 degrees, so they enjoyed being in town. It was
That's
a good
the best part about street tree inventory is you can sit in the driver's seat, crank the AC, park on the side of the street, inventory all the trees within sight, move to the next block, and just keep on cruising on those hot days.
Yep. And you could talk to both Fred and Bryce, but I think it was an eye opener for both of those foresters, and they really appreciated the opportunity to do that and get exposed to this, and it gives them eyes wide open now, more of a full field view of what we're doing here at Nebraska Forest Service, and it just isn't all rural forestry and wildland fuels treatment. It's a good opportunity for them, and so I really appreciated their help. Also, a shout out to Lucinda Mays. Lucinda, you mentioned other property, and Lucinda, I think, solo inventoried all the trees on Shadron State College campus, and that was a real coup to incorporate that into this inventory, and a huge resource because this college here plays a huge role in the community as a whole, and not only for rural economic development, but for their impact on the landscape as a whole in Shadron.
Right.
So, yep, it went good. Get down the weeds just a little bit. One thing that we didn't take time to do with this tree plotter was to map open spots on streets. And I suppose that's something, in talking with Scott Schirmer, we could come back and do a follow-up on, get an estimate on that, but we didn't take time to slow down to do that. And I think maybe that could be computed backwards if we did the math backwards on total street mile.
Yeah, that's a good point,
at.
Doak. And that's the kind of thing that you could really almost do from your desktop, just zooming in a little bit on a map like this and identifying planting locations, and Tree Plotter and a number of other software will give you the option of collecting those data points in a way where it doesn't confuse the issue with the trees that do exist, but you can still call that up as needed after you collected it.
That's
Yeah.
cool, Graham. Yeah, I'm excited to hear that, because I think that's an important piece of information that would be good to have, I think, in the final product that we take back to the tree board, as well as city council and other stakeholder groups. We anticipate taking this to Rotary, Lions Club, and all the service organizations in Chadron, because we think that this way we can use this as a tool to reach out to some stakeholders that have not stepped up in the community of Chadron yet. And you never know who your friends are out there until you go find them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I will say, Doka, after you mentioned Lucinda, so of course, Chadron, the campus, there is a wide variety of different species, cultivars, and varieties that Lucinda has been testing. And we realized very quickly, as she started cranking out a whole bunch of inventory, that our tree list was not quite up to par. And so Amanda was able to get a tree list from her records and a few other tree lists. We kind of combined them together, slimmed it down just a little bit, and then made the list. And so when you look at the tree list, when you go to identify a tree, everything is listed by the common species name. So it'll be like oak burr, oak white, oak whatever. And so, but then if it's a cultivar or variety, it'll also be in there. And so at the top of the list, you can just type in, BUR, and it'll pull up a short list, and there's bur oak at the top. So the list is fairly long. We can add to it as new varieties and cultivars, become into use, but where we have a lot of interest from tree enthusiasts like Lucinda and other Arboretum curators, we are able to tailor that list and add a few things to it. We try not to get too crazy with it, but we are also really interested to know, especially with all of these new elms that are coming out that are Dutch elm disease resistant. Well, it's no different than the cottonless cottonwood. It was selected to be cottonless. It wasn't selected for all of these other things that it needs to do to be a good tree. And so some of these elms that are coming out, yeah, they might be Dutch elm disease resistant, but they're not doing very well with Japanese beetle or elm leaf beetle or any of that. And so we do kind of want to know or have an idea, how are those doing? What's going on with them? Or like the espresso Kentucky coffee tree. I think we've killed a very large sum of those. And we ended up finding out that it was because the scion material that is above the graft is coming out of California. And so it's not cold hardy, and we were losing the tops on it. Well, that was a tree that we were using a lot in our grants. And so once we realized that that was an issue, we went back to the inventory and kind of looked, where do we have this tree? And called those people, say, hey, did your espresso survive the winter? Nope, sure didn't. And so now we know espresso's kind of on our watch list of maybe it's not all that it cracks up to be. So we do have reason and utility for all of that. But again, like Graham said earlier, a lot of our communities, they just need to know if it's an oak, a maple, an elm, etc. And that's a case of Lexington. Their assistant city administrator, Dennis Burnside, he cranked out this inventory in it was like 2 months. He did 6,400 trees. It was insane. He got a couple of the tree board members involved. He said, I don't think I've ever walked every single street in Lexington before, but now I have. And I can say that I learned a lot. And so he didn't have a whole lot of great tree ID, but what he did do was he downloaded a couple of tree ID apps and was able to do the majority of it that way, and at least get it down to, is it an oak or a maple? Not necessarily, is this a bur oak versus a red oak kind of thing. So Lexington, they did everything on their own. They're a larger community. I would say that other communities that I would probably take this approach with would be North Platte, maybe Ogallala. Some of our larger communities that have larger tree boards and have either some staff that could dedicate some time towards doing some data collection in the summer when they're looking for something to do, or they just have the capacity. So that way we can focus our time in these smaller communities that do not have the capacity or the resources to be able to do that.
Right. So to summarize, what's really important for us as an agency is to determine the appropriate tool to use. Sometimes a windshield tally is all that's needed for what the community is trying to accomplish. If they want something that's more of an ongoing management tool, then we can consider an option like this for them. And then it becomes a question of what level of involvement is the Forest Service going to have along the way? What's their capacity? And then striking some balance between collecting as much data as they need on the front end as you're out there in the field without bogging down the data collection process unnecessarily. So if they just need identification, DBH condition, then keep it just at that, and don't get too concerned about other data that they may or may not end up using, but it's going to slow you down to collect it.
Yeah, when it comes to ID, I usually give whoever is collecting my cell phone number and I tell them, text me a picture of it. If you're stuck on a tree and you don't know what it is, text me a picture of it, or just leave that field blank and it will make the dot white. Then I can go to the community, filter out all of the ones that haven't been identified by species. They can still do everything else. They can still fill in condition, DBH, all of that, but leave the species blank. And then either Graham or I can come to town, or somebody go find all of those trees and go identify what they are.
Yeah, the same way we would right here. If every tree they couldn't identify was just labeled as large deciduous or not labeled with a species at all, then we can go check just that single box, see where all those are located, go around and identify them and get that updated.
Right. Yep.
So the last point I'll make is that on condition between excellent, good, fair, and poor, we always do kind of a calibration exercise with everyone that's going to be collecting data on the front end, so that we're all having the same understanding about what we mean by excellent, good, fair, and poor. And
that goes for height and canopy width too. It's a really good point, Graham. I'm glad that you remembered to bring that up, because we try to keep the number of people collecting data in one community fairly low, because you will have that user difference. And so it's just trying to reduce that much variance within collecting, but definitely do a calibration size on height. I always use the gutter line on a house. A one-story house is typically roughly around 10 feet. Looking at the standard height of a street light, any of those other standard size things within a community, I try to make sure that I point out to the people who are collecting the data, use that for a height reference when you're estimating those things.
So we're coming up on the top of the hour. We had a couple questions along the way, but we should at least take a couple minutes, see if anybody else had questions.
Yeah, Graham, and this is Doak again. One thing that cropped up in Shadron, I would imagine that it's cropping up in other communities. And it's always, I think, fascinating to me, but folks, their first question when we meet them on the street, when we're out counting trees, they they wonder what we're doing, and they show a lot of interest in that, which is really cool, because then you know you have a captured audience, and they're curious about the inventory, and if we're just counting street trees or just park trees, but time and again they'll ask about all the trees, which includes the private trees in the backyards, and some homeowners, as I was conducting this inventory, would ask for me to come to the backyard because they wanted a forester to take a look at their sick tree, of course. But and the question I have is because I think the question will come up in city council meetings, the stakeholder meetings, the question about total tree numbers in the community. Is there a data set that you use out there in terms of a ratio of public versus private trees? Is it 3 to 1 or something?
Yeah.
Whatever.
When we were doing CTAP, that's what we had kind of arrived at, is anywhere from 3 to 4 times the number of public trees you have. You can add 3-4 times that to your public trees to get a full community inventory estimate. But
Okay.
you know, the proclivities of the city to pick certain species is going to be different than, you know, thousands of individual homeowners. So the species mix might not be quite as on target as the total number itself. But you can get a good ballpark estimate by adding another 3-4 times what you got in the public spaces. Yep, good question. And you're right, Doak. Just walking around with a tablet, looking up in the air, people are going to stop and talk to you, and it is a great jumping off point for conversation about community forestry. And occasionally you get people going, "What the hell are you doing?" But more often than not, you get people going, "What are you doing?"
And then they look at you funny because they're like, why would you be counting trees?
Yeah.
And then you explain it to them and they're like, oh, all right, well, that's kind of
Yep.
cool.
Yep. You see, I'm busy, so I got to keep moving.
Right.
So,
Any
Does
other
that-
questions, thoughts, questions?
all right, cool. We'll stop the recording then, and we'll get this link to Christina. The leadership team will probably either send those out or